This week, Joseph Menn, author and journalist with The Washington Post, will discuss his books and the best reporting on hacking and defense today. In the security news, ICS training bill, 5 myths, voice over IP devices and ransomware, miracle exploits, UNRWA and Zimbra. Guess what the most common security weakness is? Security at the device level is not simple. Keys to the kingdom. And HP says destructive firmware attacks pose a significant threat to businesses. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly.
Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cyber criminals are hiding in the conversation. Cyber criminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome everyone to Paul's Security Weekly. It is episode number 746, recorded on June 29th, 2022, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. To my left, we have a very special guest host. Mr. Tom Leonardo is here with us. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to have you here, man.
It's nice to be had.
Yes. It's always fun having you here in studio. Fellow Rhode Islander, former attorney, but not practicing, teaching
yes,
people how to be attorneys.
Yeah, well, I teach undergrads. I teach undergrads.
Undergrads.
Yeah,
right.
Don't really care, but that's okay.
And you're like get into the cyber
Yeah,
stuff.
I teach online. I teach a graduate course in cybersecurity law. I've been doing that from 2000.
We usually bank up questions, and we're like, all right, we're not attorneys, but when we have an attorney on the show, we're going to ask the attorney what they think. So we might have some. I'll dig up it's mostly in my head, and I'll probably forget.
I'm pretty sure there's at least 100 of those questions that we've banked up.
And I'll be able to answer 2. So that's good.
We'll see. Well, I mean, certainly your opinion means more than ours on that front. So, Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks, Paul. Get to hang out with you all day today, buddy.
Yeah, it's great. From the porch, from the new porch, the front porch or the back porch, I'm not sure which, Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us.
Pleasure to be here as always.
Nice to have you, my friend. Let's see. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds, and all new episodes downloaded right to your device. You can find a greatest hits playlist of sorts on that site as well. We call it our episode starter packs. You can join our mailing list Discord server, follow us on social media, and our other streaming platforms. Joining us today for our interview, Joseph Menn, author and journalist with The Washington Post. Joseph has broken some of the biggest stories in the industry and written 2 of the most widely read books in the Cybersecurity Canon. He's been a security journalist for more than 2 decades and is the author of the bestseller, Cult of the Dead Cow, How the Original Hacking Supergroup Might Just Have Saved the World. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Joseph, it's nice to have you here. How did you get into, I guess, your journey to become a cybersecurity journalist? I mean, a lot of people want to be journalists, but you chose cybersecurity.
Well, I came up the old-fashioned way. I was a police reporter, and then I covered City Hall and civil courts, and then I started covering business news. I moved out to San Francisco in '98. So I joined the LA Times the following year, and I was covering all of tech. And, a lot of it was fairly straightforward. And there was the hype of the .com boom at the time. But cybersecurity was always interesting to me because it cut across all these lines. I mean, it's a technology story, it's a business story, criminal justice story, and increasingly a geopolitical story. So it was about much more than people in tech or people in business would read. It was something really for everybody.
What was your first big cybersecurity story, in your opinion?
Well, it kind of got bigger as cybersecurity got more important. I'd say an early one was about extortion denial of service attacks. So these were groups out of Russia and Russian-speaking Ukrainians largely that were just knocking over websites and saying pay us at that time by Western Union. So this is the early OOs. And it was interesting to me, not because the technology was super sophisticated, it was just, denial of service attacks, but it was helpful to me because everybody could understand, a basic extortion business model. My grandmother could understand that, your site's going to stay down until you send us money.
Right.
So it was a way for me to get more eyes on the basic indefensibility of a lot of the internet.
For sure. I mean, it was a foreshadowing of the ransomware attacks that we see today.
Ironic, yes, it is. What's old is new again. Yeah, and my best example of it when I worked on that was there was a guy named. Some of the earliest sites to get hit were these offshore gambling sites in Costa Rica and places like that, and they were hit because their infrastructure was pretty crap, and because they needed to be online during the Super Bowl, where people go to somewhere else. They had a lot of cash, and the law enforcement in those countries wasn't going to be super responsive. So I talked to some of those sites, and they told me about a guy who had protected them, saved them, and actually figured out who some of the bad guys were. So I wrote a story about his sort of undercover efforts to infiltrate the Russian cyber mob. And so that was a front page story, and that was actually became the focus or the lead of my book years later, Fatal System Error.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, did not a lot of people want to cover cybersecurity back in the day?
No, it was really obscure. It was complicated, and most reporters don't want to sink into something that is that complicated where you have to be an expert to do it right. Most of the coverage at the time was laughably bad.
Yeah.
It was it would just it was either scaremongering from the FBI. This is not long after the Mitnick can whistle into a whistle into NORAD and send off bombs. It wasn't too far from removed from that.
Nuclear missiles with a whistle. Yeah, I remember that.
So I mean,
that was Captain Crunch.
Of course, people were whistling into the phone.
Was it Draper?
Yeah, but it was whistling
Draper.
into the phones was a thing well before Draper.
Well, but Draper was the one that was the whistle,
stuff.
And then Mitnick was the one I think was actually accused of launching nuclear missiles.
Right.
Well, before Mitnick, we were doing that.
I can't remember his name. I think he's since passed away, but he was blind and could whistle 2600.
Joey.
Yeah, it was
somebody in Florida.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a weird question for you. I'm terribly sorry, but I've got to ask it. When you cut your teeth, cybersecurity was, as you put it, and I think well put it, was an obscure subject. And you had to be an expert to understand it, and the coverage was laughably bad, and it was just covered horribly, and you brought professionalism to that. And much respect, by the way. Well done. Thank you. What subject is there today that is just as laughably underserved?
Ooh. Well, I have stayed with cybersecurity, privacy, surveillance things, and so I'm not an expert in other subjects. So I'm not the best person to ask that. I mean, I think it's kind of scary. I mean, it's the New York Times, the Washington Post, their journal. I mean, there's a saying all these papers have amazing information, are incredibly accurate, except for the subject that you happen to know something about.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that does extend, that there's bad coverage in a lot of stuff. I mean, generally, the more nuanced, the more complex it is, the harder it is for workaday journalists to do its service.
Joseph,
I think disinformation, disinformation is really hard to cover because it's still developing and it's really complicated, and there are not enough heroes and villains to make it simple for folks. But but I think, people are trying hard. There is some good coverage. And same with cybersecurity. I mean, there is some really, really good coverage. It's just that so many people are covering it now that inevitably you're going to have some turkeys. Actually, it's mostly pretty not so good.
There's a lot of turkeys. But Joseph, how did you learn about cybersecurity? Was it something you'd study? Did you study technology before, or like how did you come to be? Journalists are like you're not building servers, right? But yeah, you understand. You have an understanding. I can tell by your reading your work.
I think it actually helped that I didn't start as a tech reporter. So the problem with a lot of technology coverage in general, especially in like '99 around then, is that there's all this hype stuff, and so some people just saw themselves as the public relations part of the public relations machinery of technology. Hey, this is new and this is great and it's faster, and there's the Apple fanboys and girls and all the other stuff. And I didn't come from that. I came from going toe to toe with cops and officials that didn't want to tell me stuff, and lawsuits accusing folks of wrongdoing and whatever. And I'm a sort of an investigative background. And I think that serves you well in any coverage, but especially in tech as a counterpoint to the hype stuff. And then in cybersecurity, one of the real problems with it was, you had, Symantec and McAfee trying to scare you enough to buy their subscriptions, but not enough so that you realize that, it's actually hopeless if somebody's really after you.
Right.
Nobody had an incentive to tell the right story. The FBI doesn't want to hold a press conference and announce they can't catch anybody because they're all in Europe. And nobody wants to say that they've been hacked. And so you had these really interesting dynamics where the people telling the truth are often the criminals.
Right.
And so it really helps to have like a broad perspective and be able to sort through all that.
Mm-hmm. Did you talk to criminals? There was a lot of journalists.
I talked to everybody. That was one of my, I'll talk to anybody. So I talked to intelligence people, out and out criminals, tinkerers, professors, lawyers, security professionals, inside and outside of big companies, and just staying with it, I think, is the main thing over years.
Yeah. Because
a lot of times I got information from people who I met, in some sort of official setting where, a company wants to trot out their security whiz, and tell me one thing. But if, 5 years later, he's at some different company and he's like, well, yeah, what was actually going on was X. And, because people change jobs so often in this industry, just longevity is a huge help, because people will be able to free to tell you stuff eventually, that they couldn't initially.
Is that how you came across the NSA $10 million backdoor? RSA, sorry, $10 million backdoor?
I can't talk about anything that would point a finger at any, potential sources. I will say that, sometimes I get calls out of the blue at this point because I'm established and people have read me and they know that, I work hard and I'm fair, so they'll just give me tips. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes it is people I've known for a long time. And sometimes it's in the middle, like, people will vouch for me. Like if you're a real idiot, and you're covering hackers and you screw it up, you'll get branded with it. So again, just by sticking around and not having been run out of town on a rail, I think I get some points with people.
Sure.
So that helps too.
We'd never ask you to reveal your sources or talk about your sources, Joseph. Sorry. The question came out. I realized after I asked it that it had that connotation, but I wanted you to talk about the story of the RSA accepting money from the NSA, because that was a big story.
It was a big story. So that was not that, well, I guess it was like eight or so years ago now. So that was post Snowden. And I'd been writing about the 0-day biz and government's role in 0 days and all that sort of stuff pre-Snowden. But then the Snowden stuff came out, and among other things, it showed that the NSA had gone to enormous lengths to manipulate the standards process to get in stuff that they could hack or that they already had a backdoor into. And that was really interesting. I think a lot of people back then realized that the NSA had some of the most extraordinary talent in a lot of security and hacking, but they also have extremely talented lawyers. and sort of lobbyist types and people that look for loopholes in the law the same way that the engineers are looking for like loopholes in the technology. But this was this amazing illustration of this one. It was dual elliptic curve was the name of the cryptographic scheme, and people had pointed out that there was something hinky about it when it first was published, in that whoever picked some initial constants, if they did it right, would have access, and it got awfully vague about where the initial constants in the default setup came from. Turns out it was from the NSA. So that came out, and I didn't have a hand on it because I didn't get the Snowden documents that came out in the New York Times. But I did start looking for, who used this and why, because it was slow and it was clunky and it was suspect. So nobody really should have been using it. And so I looked at the list of those companies that said, hey, we use dual elliptic curve. It's the latest and greatest. And RSA jumped out at me because, RSA is not only, widely used, cryptographic, pioneer, but they were actually set up in, the RSA conference was set up in opposition to government rules and restrictions on what kind of good, on strong crypto. So it's pretty freaking ironic that they're using this NSA backdoor, presumably unwittingly, but something they probably should have caught if they hadn't been bought by one company and then bought by another company and wound up being this tiny piece.
To your point, Joseph, their history was in crypto. The founding members being the ones that developed the RSA algorithm. And was it Crypto by Steve Levy that chronicled that? I believe it was. I think the book is called
I think
Crypto.
You're right.
Yeah, it's Crypto by Steve Levy. So if you want insight into what Joseph's talking about, the history of RSA, that's the book to read, to come to the point where the people that created some of the most widely used cryptographic algorithms today now have a backdoor for the NSA.
It's not a good situation because they packaged it into a kit that was used by other people. So it wasn't just RSA, RSA itself. It was like a supply chain hack from our friends, in Maryland. So anyway, so after I saw that they used it, I called everybody I could think of at RSA who left RSA, in the government, ex-government, everybody who might be able to tell me why the hell they put it in. And I eventually found out it's because they got $10 million to do it.
Did that affect your personal threat profile and like how you think about your personal security, how you conduct your business? Does all that kind of play into some of those journalistic cases?
So unfortunately, when I started out, I was trying to avoid having to threat model at all. I never wanted to be a war correspondent, not because I was afraid of getting killed, because I just didn't want to have to do the math that says, well, the story's going to be 10% better if I go to the front line, but instead of a 2% chance of getting shot, there's a 5% chance of getting shot. And is it worth it for a story that's probably going to go inside the paper? Now, it's not fun doing that kind of math. And unfortunately, over the years, as this stuff has gotten more serious, I've had to. So, I mean, probably, I don't know when I got on the Russians' radar, but certainly by the time I went to Russia to do reporting on fatal system error, when I came back, that was pretty bad. I certainly made the Chinese pretty mad. But even before this, when I was just a business reporter, there were two members of the Forbes 400 that I linked to the mob, 5 families, good old American mob. So, I've had, threat models. When I was in the South, I wrote about, racists, and they threatened to kill me. It happens. So this is just part of it. So I think, again, that helps. I mean, pissing off a really, really big, powerful company, at this point, that's not a big deal. It's not as big as angering actual hackers, or criminal hackers, or certainly like other nation states.
You're very nonchalant, Joseph. But people probably want to kill me.
That's cool.
That's cool. Whatever.
I was gonna say, do you see a difference in like the way in which you do journalism today for cybersecurity as opposed to back then. I see a lot of reuse in journalism. Like you see all the stories and they all kind of collaborate and you can find, different points of view on most of the same things across most of the channels. So is some of that ingenuity and raw journalism still in effect, or are those some of the old timers that still, hustle and do it well, and the rest of the piranhas feed off of those stories?
Well, that's interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. In a way, it's less fun now, because when I was doing it, very few people were doing it, or doing it well anyway. And there is almost nobody from those days still doing it. There's a handful or less. But it's harder to find scoops because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people looking now. It's also true that even when you do have a scoop, it might not get the attention because there's so much coverage. It might get lost in it. So, I think part of my job now is sort of filtering, looking. I read a lot. I look at lots and lots of reports. I'm plugged into InfoSec communities. And it's kind of like a vetting job. Something comes, Wired breaks something, or, Vice breaks something. And I'm like, well, is that a real thing? How big is it? Does it need mainstream, mass media attention or not? And if it does, I'll try and, improve upon it and add to it and bring something new. That's not as much fun as finding it out, yourself the first time. So I really still try to do that whenever I can. I don't want to write the same story 10% better than somebody else. I want to come up with something that people would not know were it not for my efforts.
Joseph, what's been your impressions of the hacker and security community over the years? Obviously, you spent a lot of time with security professionals, hackers, and the like.
I think they're a really interesting, fascinating group of people, and I enjoy being around them. Part of the point of the last book was to emphasize the fact that an outside perspective, critical thinking, is super important, not only for technology but for the world. If everybody is just following, drawing, coloring within the lines, then there isn't real progress. And so, I wrote the last book during the previous presidential administration, and there was a lot of bad information out there, a lot of people believing bad information. And I want people to think for themselves, and hackers are a great example of that. They can have a wide variety of ethics, but a good hacker by definition is a critical thinker, and I wanted to put that on a pedestal again. Yeah.
What were some of the other things? Go ahead, Tyler.
No, I was going to say, is that one of your biggest challenges that you see we interact as hackers. We're very critical thinkers. We're very skeptical. We're very paranoid. We think well outside the box, and people call us tinfoil hat, whatever they're going to call you. They label you with those pieces. The problem I see is that critical thinking is not, like you said, mainstream. So is that one of your big challenges, is to get the general populace thinking in the way that the 1%ers are kind of thinking, and adopting that mindset of, what if this is reality? What is the critical aspects? What's the logic flow behind this? Why would this make sense? Why is no one else thinking of this? Is that some of your biggest challenge writing for mainstream, and kind of bringing that story or picture to that mainstream?
So I say a couple of things about that. First of all, that is a huge challenge. It's sometimes I say when I'm, journalism is either more important now than it's ever been, or it's completely unimportant, because you can work your butt off and come up with some major frickin' story, and a large section of the population is just going to reject it because they disagree with the premise, or they don't care whether it's true or not. That's frustrating, but that's not really my main job. There are other people. There are civics teachers in high schools. There are other people, parents, that have to sort of teach people about media savvy and not treating all sources the same and that kind of thing. And I think we'll get there, or at least we'll get better than where we are now, where there's a lot of just knee jerk whatever you want to think stuff, and sort of filter bubbles. That is part. The general population was certainly. I do try to reach them every day, but this really the Cult of the Dead Cow book is where I was trying to get both those people and newbies in cybersecurity, because as it's gotten professionalized, there are people that don't know the history and they can go to like a nice college and go work at a nice company and do cybery things without really struggling through the ethics of the choices that they're making day to day and whether it's actually helping people or not. And so I don't want to force people to read 20 years worth of Usenet, but I did want to come up with like the sort of skeleton key for like the big ethical issues that the industry has had to wrestle with as it was becoming an industry. Mm-hmm. And I was definitely thinking about the 24-year-olds who are starting out in security. And I'm like, you might want to read about where some of this stuff came from, and here's some entertaining people to make it easy going down.
It's hard to know where you're going where you don't understand where you come from, right? Got to understand.
I think that's
it's hard to go the right. It's hard to go to the right place.
Yes,
and as a college professor,
those who do not know their history. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. As a college professor, I can tell you that students like to just check off the boxes. They like the easy answers. They don't want to push, and that's not kind of a blanket statement, but I think a good majority of students really are just checking boxes off to get that degree, and they're not really thinking too deeply about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so when they read an article, they'll read the first paragraph and they say, "Oh, I'm done." They won't go beyond that. And it's a challenge in the academic area for young students in all fields, not just cybersecurity, in business. It's become a way of getting to a point A to point B without a lot of effort. And that's what I've been seeing over particularly the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're not going to be great hackers then.
No, they're going to suck.
Not.
That instant gratification is definitely a problem. I mean, that goes against the entire hacker ethos. And honestly, I would say even in InfoSec, we run into the issue of people that do not have a backbone or do not have the ability to have that criticality or that constructive criticism. Like you spend enough time in the early 90s or 2000s on a BBS forum or Usenet, and you ask the wrong question in the wrong way and you didn't do your research, like you're gonna get your ass chewed. So you may want to do that well and do your research and read and do all the things prior to asking the question. So that kind of tenacity that has forged what we are today as hackers is that missing ethos that I think that book captured very, very well. And I think like between that, what Paul's doing with Hacker Heroes, getting some of that history actually articulated, because this is some of the stuff that we couldn't talk about, things that we did back in the day, because you have that, that lawyer side where you can still go to jail over some of the stuff.
Statute of limitations on cybercrimes Tom, is that?
Yeah,
is that a thing?
Yeah,
I almost put the statute of limitations in my acknowledgments, for the book.
Right.
It would not have been possible without it.
Joseph, I want to talk about the book, and I want to, Tom, to your comment, right? I want to make sure people just don't read the first paragraph. I like listening to books, however you consume your books on your Kindle. Like, I think it's important to read these particular works on the history of hacking. I've been really into it and promoting it on the show. So Joseph, I think you've already described like why you wanted to write the book, but how did you find some of the people from the book? Like, where did your investigations, kind of start into? Because I've tried to find some hackers and some don't want to be found.
Which rocks did you have to turn over?
Yeah.
Well, there's a variety. I mean, unlike many hacker groups, the Cult of the Dead Cow is still around. And I should probably back up and say why I picked them in the first place to write about. The Cult of the Dead Cow was great because, and I call them a supergroup in the book, and some people get mad about that. But I meant supergroup in the sort of the rock and roll sense, where the original members were from other groups. So it was this sort of like this great cross section. So that's how I mean supergroup. There are some people who are super talented hackers, but there are others that are not. They're like liberal arts people. They're musicians or whatever. What I liked about the Cult of the Dead Cow as a book sort of the key to the narrative is that they go all the way back to the 80s, right? They used to be bulletin board kids, and they kept evolving and doing different things. And then, for one reason, and they were there at multiple inflection points. So like 98, 99, throwing CDs into the audience at DEF CON that allowed anyone to hijack Windows machine with back orifice. And then later, as the scene turned pro with the founding of At Stake, and then Mudge going to DARPA and doing cybersecurity for the government in a very serious way, and inventing hacktivism, which is undergoing a huge revival now. So it covers a lot of ground. But because this group is still around, it made it much easier to find them. I didn't have to go find like lone gunmen in various places. Like if they were willing to play ball with me under certain terms, they would just reach out to the others of the group, or somebody knew where a retiree, how they could be reached in almost all cases, except for the guy that deliberately disappeared and then none of them been able to find Jesse.
It happens.
But so it wasn't that hard. I had known some members from my prior reporting, and frankly, some of them knew me because my first solo book about Napster, there's a reference to the Cult of the Dead Cow in my Napster book, and some of them were early beta testers of the Napster program. So they saw that I'd done a decent job with that book, and they knew they could talk to the people who I'd interviewed for that book. And so some people from the Napster era come back in this book, like nearly 20 years later.
Well, I think do you find, Joseph, that people want to tell their story now? Like enough time has passed and they want to tell their story, and they want to tell you about stuff that they normally wouldn't talk about before, and they want to document it, right? They want their 15 minutes of fame, right?
That's right, and I'm not the only beneficiary of that. I think you are. There's a great oral history of the Loft that the Decipher guys did. Yep. There are a lot of people that are ready to talk, and they want the legacy to be known, particularly if the statutes run. But there's both a sort of an ego reason and a historical reason, and in some place, helping the kids reason, because they didn't think that there was going to be, frickin' 1 million people in this industry when they were doing their thing, but now that there are, they want people to know some of the history, and it's valuable. So we
didn't even think we were going to get paid for this at one point, right?
Yeah, it was a hobby.
Yeah.
So I can hack into my
It was
video
all about
game,
street cred, baby.
Yeah, and street cred.
That's right. I mean, that is important, that history piece, man. I really think that before we start to see, people, some of us have been doing this a long time. We're getting a little older. Like there are people that have passed away that had stories that went to the grave with them. And I think a lot of those, like even some of the operations and stuff that happened with inside the government, I think really needs to be historically valued in a different way. Yeah, there's OPSEC, there's times where that needs to be kept close chest, but at some point, like someone really does need to recount that history, because there's a good portion of geopolitical aspects that have come through because of things that people have done that no one can talk about or haven't talked about yet that should talk about it at some point.
Yeah. And on the other side of that is that we have an oral history and an oral tradition. We actually have legends now. We have myths and legends in the hacker world that aren't stories per se. I mean, they're stories, but they're not authenticated. They're not, what's the right word? Provenance. They don't have the provenance of a ability of a book type of thing. Right. We have legends. We have things told in whispers. It's really funny.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was one of the real challenges in writing the book, is like I heard these amazing stories. On the other hand, the Cult of the Dead Cow, among many other things, was like media tricksters, and they fooled the media all the time. So it was like that was my worst nightmares, that I'd get taken in, because some of these whispered stories turn out to are totally true, and some are not. And I had to have incontrovertible proof of anything I was going to put in the book. So it's doable. It's just a lot of frickin' work. I think another thing that makes this harder is the overclassification of on the government side. I mean, I'm not alone, weirdo in the media who thinks everything should be declassified tomorrow. There are a lot of high intelligence officers who are like, everything is so classified we can't talk about anything that's important. And that's not a healthy for democracy. You got to be able to declassify enough that you can have actual conversations and make decisions about stuff. And actually, it's actually going in that way. We've seen the rapid declassification of stuff over the Ukraine war, which was effective as intelligence. I mean, that helped move things ahead, and also just educated people. And I certainly would like to see a lot more of that.
I never realized, Joseph, how much of a media hackers and hacktivists CDC was. Was that a realization to you, or do you kind of knew that they were hacking? Did they hack the media? Is that the right way to say it?
So what did they call it? Media jamming was one of the things they called it. There's a bunch of different names. Actually, that was the most alarming part. I knew it was important, but when I first heard of CDC, I dismissed them pretty soon after because they were saying stuff that was obviously wrong. They were for fun or whatever. And I'm like, I have enough of a hard time parsing true things that I'm not going to spend time with stuff that's tricksterdom or satire. And so that was actually, I approached that sort of reluctantly. The hacktivism stuff I think is really interesting, and unfortunately they go together because a lot of hacktivism is about spreading awareness, and so sometimes you can get media legit, and sometimes you get that by fooling the media. And CDC did that in a really big way. And it wasn't until the book that some of their greatest stuff was exposed as a fraud, even though some people suspected it at the time. So, I mean, I saw that as like part of the duty, and it was great that they, were willing, those who were in on it, more or less were willing to fess up to it. But even if they weren't, I was gonna put the truth out there. Media and hacktivism go together, and it's awkward for me to write about because I'm media, but it's part of the story.
What was some of the biggest things that you kind of debunked? What was one thing as an example?
The biggest is the Hong Kong blondes. So, right when they were sort of at their peak of popularity in 98, 99, 00, which happened to be right when, hackers were becoming more like a big part of the popular culture, and DEF CON was just, becoming huge. They were pushed to talk about stuff that was overtly political, that wasn't even that technological. And the Great Firewall of China, and censorship in China was sort of a logical initial target for sort of politically minded tech. And that's because, there were people in the CDC that worked for the United States government, and there were people in the CDC that hated the United States government. And you had a sort of a range. I mean, they're sort of generally left, but you had a range of views. There's certainly some libertarians. But nobody liked what China was doing. I mean, if you're going to get hackers to agree on anything, it's that information wants to be free or should be free, or people should have access to information. So they targeted China, and they worked on an anonymous browsing technology. And their work on that actually wound up prompting Tor to put in a browser, which they hadn't done before. People were FTPing and stuff. But to spread the word about China, some members of the CDC, really as Oxblood invented this group called the Hong Kong Blondes. And it was supposedly they were, the CDC was in an alliance with these people in China who were democracy activists and hackers, and they're helping them, fight the authorities in China and spread the word. And it got big story in Wired. It got front page of the Los Angeles Times. It got a lot of attention because it was fun. People wanted it to be true,
believe it, yeah.
And they let their guard down. And it's total crap.
So there was no such group in China. It was, the whole thing was made up, right? Yeah,
no.
I remember from the book.
But one of the bizarre things is that it got so much attention as the initial hacktivism, instance of hacktivism, that a few years later, and I recount this in the book, there are people who were doing actual protect the Tibetans technology, who contacted Oxblood and hey, I want to hook up with this group, tell me more about this stuff. And they wound up actually doing stuff. So like this, it was really weird. You build this fable and it will come true.
Right.
It actually wound up helping people, via Tor
like
and via other
startups.
methods.
Is that a direct correlation to today's Ukrainian Russia situation?
Well, so hacktivism has had this, huge resurgence. It sort of got it was sort of faded away for a while, and then Anonymous took up the mantle, and anybody can call themselves a hacktivist. But there has been a lot of political hacking, some of which is governments in disguise, and some of which is criminals in disguise, and some of which are people driven by moral causes. And there has been, the thing in Ukraine is amazing because you actually have the government of Ukraine like retweeting major anonymous accounts and saying, yes, come join our fight. And here's the IT army. Here's our Telegram channel. Join it, and we'll call out some targets for you.
That's crazy.
It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible.
Joseph, how long?
I think that's one of the big missing pieces from a journalistic standpoint is the painting of the pictures of hackers has really taken that kind of anonymous face, right? Like, that's portrayed as good and bad. That's got, negative connotations. It's also got some positive reinforcements that work in conjunction with it. But I think when there is a valid cause, the banding together and understanding of that ethos and that morality line that ends up having to be crossed, like there's not as many people that are comfortable crossing that because of the pictures that have been painted. And, when we need to come together, that doesn't necessarily get painted in the best of lights. I think the Ukraine thing has helped that a little bit, but there's also the negative side of that, even in InfoSec and the news tweeted with inside of InfoSec, like people take a very negative portrait or view of hacktivism and where it helps and where it doesn't help. So I think, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot of places that mainstream journalism can add to that or diminish those returns as well.
Tyler, considering that the painting is behind you, I just had to point out that was an amazingly funny thing to say. And I'll shut up now. Please go ahead.
Again, one of the reasons that why the old folks are useful for the new folks is that there was this kind of magical population bubble that had a lot of the CDC in it, where they came of age around the time of war games, and they're like, wow, we can do really interesting things with a modem, and let's start war dialing. But before it all got taken away 3 years later by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which says you couldn't do this anymore. So what people today don't understand, by and large, is that if you were anything remotely hackery in the old days, you wound up breaking the law. You were a teenager, you were calling a bulletin board outside of your area code, and your parents would get a multi-$100 phone bill. And so everybody would get a Sprint card, or they'll get it passed around like a phone calling card number or whatever. And everybody, or you rip off Ma Bell the old fashioned way, with a whistle.
With a blue box.
Everybody did that. So it is hilarious to me that everybody who is in their 50s and is now a CISO at a Fortune 500 company, if they're any good, they're a criminal. They were breaking the law when they were a teenager. And that doesn't mean that criminality is terrific, but it means that all those people had to sort through what was ethical, irregardless of what the law was. And, you might not agree with where they came down on any given point, but they actually had to think about it. And I think people today are unaccustomed. Many will just follow the law, or many will just do what their government wants, or they'll reject everything and be kind of nihilist. I think learning a little bit about where people decided to draw their lines, and how they argued with other people who they respected who were drawing lines slightly differently, I think it's super valuable to try and make sense of today's world.
Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, how long did it take you to write the book? How many years of research and looking through?
So me personally, it's hard to say. Yeah, I can't put an exact number on it. The book process itself was a man year, which is normally what it takes me to do a book. I guess I should say a person year. But it wouldn't have been possible to do that from a standing start. I did that. I was able to get in a position to start working on the book because I've been covering this stuff for so long, and because I knew some of the people. So I don't know, so in a way, it took me 20 years to write the book.
It's an ongoing process, and you already had a foundation to get started, pretty much.
Yeah, because like some of these people aren't going to talk to you, Joseph, as I know. Like if you don't know person X, person Y is probably not going to. You build upon those relationships to build clout.
That's right.
One of the gifts I think given to you, Joseph, was the Beto O'Rourke story that broke. That I think was. I thought it was wonderful, not just for you. I think it was wonderful. You deserved every moment of the spotlight and the attention that this got. But I think it was great for the hacking community as well. More people are going to read the book. More people are going to be like, "What is this? How do you have a politician that was once a hacker?" Like, people were like astounded by this. Share from I'm curious your perspective, like how you learned that and how that unfolded from your perspective.
So, as I was trying to figure out whether or not I was going to write this book, I was thinking about, how to present it to a publisher, and the process normally is a book proposal, which is a pain. It's like a sample chapter and like this long and this summary of all the other chapters, and then these days you sort of have to do their marketing plan for them and
describe the.
It's audience. A lot of different things.
Yeah, how many people are going to be interested in reading this book? Is there number
right?
one
What's
question?
your target audience? All this stuff that isn't nearly as much fun as reporting. Certainly one of the bullet points was, hey, there's a guy who's a member of Congress who was in CDC. And, that was exciting, and it was like a part of it, but it was not the main thing. And I said, we in early discussions with my publisher, like, decent chance I'll be able to figure out who it is, but maybe not. Again, I certainly can't promise it, but it's cool either way. Maybe I could get the congressman to talk on condition of anonymity or whatever. That's fun. You normally don't get congressmen who are hackers.
Yeah.
And then while I was starting to work on the book, early on, I didn't know his name, but I saw coverage of this guy that was in Congress that was running for Senate, and it said, he was around 50, and he'd had a software company after college, and he's from Texas, which is where CDC started. And he was in a punk band at one point. I'm like, come on. It really seemed like it fit. I mean, I hate to stereotype, but it kind of fit the profile.
Yeah. Could have been Johnny Rotten. So, you don't know. I mean, from the could have been Johnny Rotten from a punk band.
I would be surprised. Though there is a Sid Vicious in like MOD, maybe. Like one of the old,
there is
one of the really LOD. One of the, I think there was a Sid Vicious. Not the same guy.
Not the same guy. Yeah.
Are you sure?
Pretty sure. So I asked the guys I knew in CDC, is it Beto O'Rourke? And they're like, we are not going to say anything about who it is or who it isn't. Sorry. And I was like, and so I negotiated for a while. I tried a little while, and I'm like, well, what if it doesn't come out until after the Senate election? Because the book wasn't going to be done till then. And I'm on leave at this point from my day job, which at that point was at Reuters. And they're like, really? Not until, after the election? I said, yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to write a big story about this race. I'm trying to write about the entire history of hacking. And this is like a cool way to tell it, a piece of the story. And they said, okay, yeah, it's Beto O'Rourke, and we're really freaking proud of him.
Yeah.
So then I, as a continued report, I got to meet Beto, and I said, look, I'm writing this book. It's, it's about all of hacking, but, it's nominally about the CDC. And, it's mostly positive, but there's also crimes and there's some jerks, and, I'm not going to hide anything, but the point is to help, rehabilitate the idea of hacking and explain what's important, whatever. Would you talk to me? And he's like, Yeah, sure. And he gave me this terrific interview about like why it was really formative to him and why he thinks it's important for society to welcome people with that kind of a background, and all the things he got out of it and how it helped him in his career, and how he sort of thought of some of what he's done in politics as hacking like. And it was freaking terrific. And I was like, terrific, thanks. And so I went back to finishing my book, and then and like, well, maybe the book is going to have like a sitting senator. And I think, and I thought he probably talked to me in part because he was either going to lose the race and get out of politics, or he was going to win this race and the book would come out and then he'd have 6 years to live it down. I mean, I don't think he knew people would use it against him. But also, he's like kind of like a Jackie Robinson, barrier breaking guy in admitting to be the first serious politician to admit to a hacking background, because he'd already been, people already knew he'd been busted for a DUI. So it's not even the first crime he's been associated with. So all these things made it, I think, reasonable for him to talk to me. In addition to my phenomenal skills, and so I'm like watching out of the corner of my eye what happens in the election, and he doesn't get, he loses, which was expected. It's like, okay, so I'll be an ex-congressman, was a member of the Cult of the Dead Cow, not just a hacker, but like a member of the most influential hacking group in U.S. history. This is cool. And so I'm writing away, and then like, wait a minute, Beto's going to Iowa. Wait a minute, he's like traveling the country. What the hell is going on here? And I realized he was probably going to run for president. And I'm like, oh boy. If the embargo is off, I'm allowed to write that he was a hacker. I'm allowed to write that he was in the CDC. I don't think I can hold that for the book. I think people, if he's a viable candidate for president, I think people need to know that. So I wound up scooping my own book. 3 months before the book came out, I'm like, okay, I got to write that Beto O'Rourke was in CDC. It's a mixed bag for book sales, I guess. It certainly got people attention. It told them that there was a book coming out. Especially after I got, me and Beto both got attacked by Sean Hannity on air, and friends.
I think that's a mark of pride.
It's a battle wound.
He was lecturing me about journalism ethics, and it was like, and so-called journalist Joseph Menn, where this is a guy that was advising Trump, during his rallies and stuff like that. So, I mean, I guess I can live with that. But anyway, it was weird to scoop my own book, but I'm okay with it. It got more attention. And normally with books, you can either do a historical thing that people will maybe teach in colleges and, some year and still read 10 years from now. But many people will not know that the book is even out because there's nothing super topical. Or on the other extreme, you write a book about Uber or whatever the .com of the moment is, or something, and it gets a lot of buzz and press right away, and people read it, but people will not read it in 20 years.
Right.
And this book, I got phenomenally lucky because I was able to do both. I mean, I wrote it as a historical sweeping book that'll still be relevant years from now, and then I kind of lucked into like the incredible news peg of a guy running for president.
That's amazing. It's interesting to think about. We've mentioned some of the other hacker groups, right? LOD, Legion of Doom. You had the Masters of Deception.
Loft.
MOD. You had Loft.
Woo.
How did those all interact? I mean, I guess you chose CDC for specific reasons you mentioned, but all of those groups are historically significant and all interacted with each other at some juncture, right? In some way. All different ways, but...
Right. So that's another reason that I picked CDC instead of one of the other groups. CDC had members of LOD. It had a member of MOD, despite the fact that they were like, MOD was created in opposition to LOD, and they famously went to war.
Right. Was that Mark Abeen? Mark Abeen was both? Was in both? Was it Mark?
So I'm thinking of John.
Was it John? John Threat.
John Threat. Yeah. But there are others that went from LOD to MOD. Anyway, the John Thread is not in CDC, but there was at least one of each. And they also had, in fact, it was an MOD guy that didn't get caught. It's one of the very few that did not get caught.
Yeah, because they were all. I mean, that was the basis for the movie Hackers, is the MOD story, and them all being arrested.
It's a great story. Woo Woo. There are multiple people who are in Woo Woo that are also in CDC as well. Mm-hmm. And then if you had 4 people from the Loft over its years that were in CDC. Mm. So it's one great group that brings all these folks together, right. And I'm allowed to go on tangents and write about, here's some woo-woo history and here's some MOD history.
And they all fought with each other at certain times too. There was a lot
certain times. I mean, woo-woo wasn't like, woo-woo's also had people from different groups in it, ADM and some more. It was pretty gray. Gray hat, definitely some black hats. Some black hats in it. Mm. MOD and LOD are mostly black hat. CDC had some black hats, but it was mostly gray and some white. But that was a way to tell about more, a way to show again, more of the interesting history and the interplay. Because back in the olden days, you would actually have CEOs and criminals hanging out together because they're interested in the same technical issues. Mm. And I think that's very, very hard to do these days.
Mm. You think there's more to unpack there? I mean, you mentioned some groups.
Hacker history stuff?
Yeah, but even the hacking groups, there's more stuff to unpack, I feel like.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm so far into it now that, I'm always going to say yes. I'm like, I geek out about it. But I think it's a really interesting mix of cultures and laws and countries and ways of making money. I think the hacking groups are fascinating.
It's awesome. Did you hear that beeping? Some hacker groups are upset that we're talking about them. They're hacking the broadcast.
I was wondering, was it me? Okay.
I don't know who the...
Oh my God, that's Max Headroom. He's right there.
That's great, though. I do encourage people, certainly read the book for sure.
What do you think from a disclosure point now in breaking things that are relevant to the industry, to journalists and those that we can trust? Like, what are some of the caveats to that? What are some of the recommendations? What are some of your lessons learned and things you would recommend to people that have done interesting things over the years and maybe find themselves in interesting places that might need reporting? Like, what are some of those lessons that you can provide?
Well, I think one is...
he's asking for a friend, just to be clear. Mm-hmm. He's asking for a friend. Totally for a friend, not for him, ever.
Not all journalists are the same. There's an incredible variety of journalists. There are people who are more interested in the history stuff. There are people who can devote more time to a topic. There are people that are sort of overwhelmed by the crush of daily reporting, and there's some that aren't trustworthy and that don't have track records. So, I mean, one thing to do would be to find somebody that has written about things that are roughly in your area, and then ask people who have spoken to that reporter how they feel like they were treated by that reporter. And then ask and do go on the record, get an agreement that it's off the record. If it's really sensitive, get an agreement in the beginning that it's off the record before you say anything interesting. Because you can't just declare something is off the record retroactively, and you can't even just declare it yourself and continue to talk without an agreement. You need an actual agreement. One of the great things is that there is a case called Cohen versus Cowles Media, in which the Supreme Court held that an oral agreement with a journalist is an enforceable contract. First Amendment is the First Amendment. But if I promise you anonymity and then I break that, you can sue me and take whatever I have, which if I'm a journalist isn't too much, but you can do that. And that's something that's very serious, particularly with the journalists who know it. But
that tied into the CDC book, Joseph, right? Because throughout your research, there were several hackers that were like, you can only use my hacker handle, but that changed by the time you went to
that was maybe the biggest surprise in the writing process for me. Mm-hmm. I mean, well, it's hard to top. You've got a guy running for president, but maybe the second thing was I assumed that I was going to have some names because some had already been outed.
Yep.
But most had not, and I some were willing to come out, as I was early writing the book. But I expected that there would some would say I couldn't use their names, and I would just use the handles, and that's fine. And then in the last week, where I could do anything to the copy of the book, everybody fell into line. And obviously they had been talking to each other, and I'm not privy to those conversations, but I think part of it was look, if Beto, who was the most to lose, is on the record, then, we should march with him, and provide some cover. And again, I'd like to thank the statute of limitations, but, that was really great because for credibility, when you're telling these stories that, I could confirm, but people might not believe that I could confirm, a real name means a lot.
Yeah. I agree. Joseph, I want to ask you about some of your greatest hits, as it were. I think the Russian ties to QAnon is super interesting because I was just seeing someone I follow on social media was like, oh yeah, I met someone that still thinks QAnon is a thing. And then as we're talking about CDC and hacktivism and hacking the media, I think that ties in very, very nicely. And I watched the QAnon documentary on, HBO, had a documentary on it. Super fascinating. I mean, really in the spirit of some of the things CDC laid the groundwork for.
Yeah, I don't agree with all of its conclusions, but it is interesting, and it is a fascinating topic. It's also a scary one. I mean, in a way, is a lot more scarier than Cyber Pearl Harbor happening tomorrow. Is the fact that you have something like, I don't know, a quarter of people or a quarter of Republicans or some really scary number believe that QAnon is real. The Q is real, and he was in the Trump administration. It's really alarming. But that's really more of an educational challenge than a journalistic challenge.
Sure.
But go ahead.
No, I was going to say, doesn't that just show the point earlier of that 1% of critical thinking and the ability for the general population to be swayed based on the general media and where their outlets are coming from? That is really the war at hand. That's China, that's Russia, that's disinformation, that's misinformation. That is the war that we're facing. And from a cybersecurity standpoint, there's not a lot that we can do to affect that other than what we're currently combating on different social media platforms. And even
yes. Skewed. Well, I think you can do some. So a lot of InfoSec, I didn't think I was going to be writing about disinformation, until 2016. There are similar skills in cybersecurity and in sorting out bad information and, tracking it back and looking for correlations in clusters and social media accounts or whatever. So, I mean, I think the people in cybersecurity who are moving into quality of information, disinformation, whatever stuff, that's great. So you certainly can do a service there. I also think the mainstream media can do a service, and it's a bit of far afield, but I mean, the collapse of mainstream media in places that are not the national centers is one of the biggest disasters for the country, because people are not getting, great local news in most cities. Their paper's going away, or it's been hollowed out, and the local TV station is part of a chain that's, can be pretty wacko. And so they turn to the internet and they get garbage on the internet. So it's a real problem.
That's not too far off from what Russia is facing right now, or even China, and what the state is controlling at this point. Media, a good portion of the mainstream media is a state-controlled or agenda-controlled avenue, right? So how do we get back to the journalistic mantra, just like the Hippocratic Oath in healthcare? How do we get back to that place where what is being served is raw, real, and unskewed from that standpoint?
Well, so that's another major thing that InfoSec people can do, is that they can get people decent information. So VPNs in Russia are a very big deal right now. VPNs in China have been a big deal for a while. Tor, uptake of Tor is surged as Russia has cracked down. One interesting difference between China and Russia is that, Russia allowed internet stuff to blossom for long enough that there's a whole educated class, a tech-savvy class that is used to reading international media, and they are not just accepting what the government tells them. I've been writing about Russia-Ukraine stuff, and I talked to a number of people in Russia who are saying that it's a generational thing now. If their parents are in the country, the middle of the country, they are more likely to read the official press and take the government at its word. And the younger people who have lots of apps on their phones are less likely to believe what the government is putting out there. Unfortunately, China, the tech development came after, the immense control apparatus was in place. And it's a much harder fight to get people decent information there. But that is one thing you can do in tech. Absolutely. You can volunteer your time, contribute to some of these open source efforts. You can do a lot of good.
You were going to say something about Q as well.
Yeah, just because you mentioned that story. So I did write some stories that said that I didn't say that Russia invented QAnon, but they were key early boosters, absolutely critical in propagation through botnets on Twitter and elsewhere, and in steering some of the early promoters to other conspiracy theories that matched up. And Q didn't come from whole cloth. Q followed these other 4chan posters like FBI Anon, who said very similar things. So there were these early efforts, and part of it it is ingenious. It's just opportunism. They're like, oh, here's something else that'll drive people crazy and divide the country. A lot of disinformation, effective disinformation, is especially the way Russia does it, is throw 100 stories at the wall and then make it very, very hard for somebody to pick out the one that is true. And they don't care which one takes off of the 100. Is it, child porn? Is it, whatever? They don't care. Is it, U.S. bioweapons, gave us COVID? Whatever, so they'll just see what gains traction, and then they'll put more chips behind that.
Interesting.
And that's part of what drove QAnon.
What are you working on today, Joseph?
Well, I can't tell you the good stuff.
Of course not. We'll have to wait and read it when it comes out, right?
I can tell you that I'm generally interested. Unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that I'm interested in is really boring to regular people, and my job is making it interesting. That was the great thing about CDC, is they're all these larger than life characters. I'm interested in software supply chain security, and but I'm searching for the ways to make that sexy enough that the average member of Congress might read about it. The fatal system error, when I had guns and hookers, I'm like, okay, now maybe somebody will read this. Even if it was really, it's like my end goal was to come up with a public policy document. It's like, I know I need the hookers. Nobody's gonna get to the policy stuff in the last chapter. So there's some of that. What else am I working on that I can talk about? I'm always interested in
crypto or Web 3.0 or any of the exchanges, blockchain, any of the kind of hipster outlier kind of thing that the general public's starting to get interested in?
So, my most valuable commodity is my time. I have to be very, very judicious about where I put my time. And it was a challenge that I really came up against in '99 when I was covering the dot-com bubble. It's like, people filed prospectuses to go public that say, yes, our CEO just got out of jail, and nobody's ever made any money in this field, and we've lost more money than you even thought was in the world. And people would still buy the stock because of the greater fool stuff. I don't know why they bought the stock. And so it's like, it makes my job much harder. What's left to expose? I mean, they admitted everything, and you bought the stock anyway. So my threshold went way up for what I was going to write about and spend time on. And I've regarded crypto, frankly, in a lot of the same way. It's like, this, not all crypto, much of crypto is an obvious Ponzi scheme. And there are hucksters all over the place, and there's criminality, and the best use case is money laundering, and it's obviously crap. So why should I spend a lot of time to writing about it? Unfortunately, it's gotten so big and so important that sometimes I have to write about it now, and it's harder to bring as much value to it. But there have been times. So as a means of ransomware, as when the FBI was able to claw back some money after Colonial Pipeline, that's interesting. Government efforts to regulate it is interesting. And some of the criminals are just so exotic and get away with so much that the collapse of Mount Gox that it's worth writing about. But again, I've got a very high bar for that stuff.
Joseph, it's been wonderful having you on the show. I have 5 questions left for you. Are you ready to play the silly 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Okay, I'll give it a shot.
Alrighty. 3 words to describe yourself.
Oi. Committed. Idealistic.
Committed to an institution. Let's be clear on this. Sorry.
One of them was a Pepsi. Just one Pepsi.
To an ideal, all right? Come on.
And a modest facility with words.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Words has to be your only answer here. I mean,
the cutting remark.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Like, that's actually a painful question for an author because he has to think about that.
It is, because coming up with a title for a book is not easy.
He's running through the 500 he's thrown away now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know. I feel like journal. I usually, it takes me a while to come up with a book title. Mm-hmm. I might start with like themes and then try and get something more grabby out of them. I guess a theme to me as a person, I'd have to say anti-establishment. I mean, there are times when I completely agree with what one government or a different government is doing. But I go in skeptical, not cynical, but skeptical.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Sneakers, by far. Sneakers is, even if you know nothing about hacking, Sneakers is a fantastic movie.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents. Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Fictional or otherwise.
You're slacking there, Josh.
All right.
John Reed and Lou Reed.
Fantastic. Joseph, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Thanks a lot.
With that, security news coming up next. Stay tuned.